You might have watched my previous video in which I made a cutting board with the asanoha pattern. A lot of people said lots of really nice things about the cutting board. They thought it looked really great, but I was never very satisfied with it. And if you want to see the details of how I made that and why it didn't work out the way I wanted it to, please go check out that video. But I decided to give it another try, and I like this one a whole lot better. I think this one is, as far as I can tell, perfect. It's not completely perfect, woodworking never is, but I think it's as good as I can get it, and I'm very satisfied with it. If you'd like to see how I made this cutting board with the asanoha pattern, using all of these jigs that I had to make in order to make the cutting board, if you'd like to see how I did that, then please watch the rest of the video. This is my drawing of what the first asanoha based cutting board was supposed to look like, and this is what it actually turned out like. For this version, I'm going to use thinner pieces between the triangles, so thicker triangles, and also a bigger contrast between the dark and the light colored wood. I think that will look a lot better. This is how I worked out all the dimensions. You need to kind of make a spreadsheet. If you want to make this one, by the way, the left-hand column here with the 12mm width is what I made in my previous video. The dimensions on the right-hand column are what I'm going to make for the new one. And when we put those dimensions onto the drawing, this kind of looks like this. So if you want to make it, these are the dimensions that I used. Of course, you can make it with any dimensions you like. I already had some of the black colored wood left over from my previous cutting board. In fact, I have more again, actually. I need these two boards to make enough pieces for this cutting board. If I cut them into 4 triangles and do end grain for the black pieces, I've drawn on the end of this board how that needs to be cut. And for the lighter colored, I bought some new maple wood, which is a good choice. It's nice hard wood. That'll be side grain. And in order to cut the pieces for that, they need to be 8mm thick and 50mm deep. The black colored wenge has been sitting in my workshop now for probably the best part of a year. And the maple I ordered arrived about 6 weeks ago, so it's had time to acclimatize to the humidity level in my workshop. So here's all my maple wood cut into quarters, lengthways on the bandsaw. I prefer to use the bandsaw rather than the table saw because I just think it's a lot safer. I know it's a bit slower, but I'm not doing this commercially. And it wastes a lot less wood, like the blade is very thin. So the next step will be to put these through the planer to get them to the correct thickness. They're currently 11mm thick, and I need 8mm, so I got to remove 3mm from the side of each piece. I think I might take 1mm off on the jointer just to make sure they're as straight as they possibly can be, and then take the rest off on the other side with the planer. So after all the sawing and planing, they turned out to be about 49mm. Getting the thickness of the boards this way to be exactly 8mm is critically important for the design. It won't fit together correctly in the asanoha pattern if that's not exactly 8mm. So before going ahead with planing the nice maple, I cut this little bit of plywood on the bandsaw to be about 9mm thick. It's actually 9.8mm. Now I'm going to put it through the planer and gradually lower the planer little by little until I get this to be very precisely 8mm. And then when I've got the plane set exactly correctly, I'll be able to put the maple through and get it exactly the right thickness. So after many passes through the plane, making very tiny adjustments each time to the cutting depth, you can see I've got to a point where it now says 7.99, 8.02, 8.08, 8.04. So as near as I can get it, this is 8 millimeters thick. There's nothing more beautiful than a perfectly machined pile of wood. This wood's exactly 49 millimeters by 8 millimeters, and it's perfectly flat, square, straight, and ready for use. Doing something extremely accurately and doing it repeatedly requires a jig. So next thing is to make a jig. So the last time I made some kumiko, I did make these jigs. I won't go into these in detail. You can go watch the video about the making of the kumiko if you want to see exactly how these are made and how they're used. Unfortunately, though, as is often the case, these won't work for this particular project because the wood is much larger than these jigs were designed to handle. I used my miter saw to cut all of the correct lengths for the various pieces of this grid. So the ones that run horizontally like this are 5 times the pattern length being here, 110 millimeters. So there are 5 times. And then there are 4 pieces that run diagonally in this direction, 4 pieces, and then 4 pieces in the other direction diagonally, which are all 4 times the pattern length. And then there are 4 pieces here, 1, 2, 3, and 4, that are 3 times the pattern length. And that will create the kumiko grid that we're looking for. And after all of that, this is all the wood I have left over. Very small amount of waste material. So I've made these 2 jigs for cutting the grid pieces. It's very important that these 2 long pieces here are perfectly vertical and perfectly parallel. It's also super important that this angle at the end is exactly 30 degrees. And the other one is the mirror image. So one does the left hand or one does the right hand. I made sure these were perfectly vertical by gluing these pieces together with a 3-to-1 block inserted into each end and clamped tightly like that. This means they're definitely parallel and the sides are definitely vertical. When we use these jigs, we're going to get a piece of wood like this, which has 2 30-degree bevels on it, which are perfectly centered on the piece of wood. We're going to put one of them in here, and we're going to use this jig to cut some 30-degree cuts in it like this. It's very important that when you do a 30-degree cut this way, and then you take it out and put it in this jig, and you do a 30-degree cut on this jig, that those 2 cuts will overlap exactly in the center of the wood. That's very, very important. So what I did was to make sure of that was to get my square, put the piece of wood tight up to here, put the square here, and then draw a line. I don't know if you can see the line. The line is here. And then move this piece of wood over to here and make sure that when I put the square on this side that it also comes exactly to that line. So now we need to create some marks along the side of this jig where we're going to cut the the slots out of the strips so they all fit together. And according to my design, they need to be 109.86 millimeters apart. So what I did is I started at 70 millimeters, added 109.86, and added another 109.86, etc., all the way down to create these positions in millimeters along my jig. I need to do that on this jig, the right-handed one, and also the left-handed one. Next mark, 179.86. So 179, almost 180, tiny bit below 180. Locked in on 60.0 degrees. Okay, so on this side, we're going to mark them in this direction, opposite to the other one, but using the same list of millimeter measurements, starting with 70, 179.86, etc. So to test the accuracy of this jig, we need to put this in this side and get a ruler, go across the two marks that we made earlier, and draw a line on this piece of wood here. Then we need to flip it around, place it on this side, and draw a line across this piece of wood. Now these two lines should cross exactly in the middle of this piece of wood, so we can get one of these center finding jigs, and we can use it to draw a center line. I don't know how well you can see that on the camera, but that center line goes exactly through that cross. That's what you're looking for. So we now have knife marks at regular intervals and at 60 degrees across both of those jigs, but in opposite directions. So we're going to put the knife in the knife mark. We're going to put our piece of beech across like that, and then we're going to draw or mark a line with the marking knife on the other side. So, drop the knife into the knife wall, bring up the square. We're only going to cut 2/3 of the depth, so that we don't need it to be all the way down. We don't want to put the saw in the middle of the knife mark because it'll saw a little bit either side of it. We actually want this to be the outside edge. We want to make sure the inside of the edge of the saw is on this line. So we need to take a chisel and just cut a very tiny chamfer going down towards the line, so that the saw will go into the chamfer, it will slide down up to the line and saw exactly on the line. Like 1 or 2 millimeters back from the line, and a couple of light taps. Okay, that will, I'll clear this out so you can see it better. That will make a little mark that the saw blade will now sit in. We need to start sawing very, very carefully. So the accuracy of this jig will determine the accuracy of the pieces of wood that we cut using the jig. So it's very important to take your time when you're making the jig. So right now I have 2 of these cut. I have 1 slot cut in this left-hand jig and 1 cut in the right-hand jig. And I'm not going to cut the rest yet because I'm going to test the accuracy of the jig first. Before I can cut these pieces in my jig, I'm going to need to cut 60-degree angles on the ends. You'll see why when it goes into the jig. I'm going to use this chop saw, but one thing I noticed about my chop saw as you can see, is if I put that up against here, you can see that there's a small gap there. This is not actually vertical. In fact, you can easily move it about. It's not even very stiff. So the bottom part of the fence is actually pretty vertical, but this top part is absolutely not. So what I like to do is use a 3-to-1 block as a kind of guide to hold the wood while I cut it. So the best way to cut two 30-degree angles or 60-degree angles, depending which way you measure them, onto the end of this piece of wood and have them meet exactly in the middle, is to put it into the miter saw this way around against an end stop, so we know like the distance from the blade, and cut it once, and then flip it over like this, and cut it again, and then you'll find that the two bevels will meet exactly in the middle. Okay, as you can see, that's added two 30-degree bevels on the end of this piece of wood. So the way that we use this jig is that we get our strips of wood that are going to make up our Kumiko grid. We have to drop them into here and then slide them hard up against the end, like this. And we're going to put a clamp on here as well. And when you look at, I'll show you a view from the top here, and you'll see why we cut them at 30 degrees on the ends. So coming over the top of the jig here, looking at how these are snugged in, you see how cutting the ends of these pieces at 30 degrees makes them have a nice hard stop against the end of the jig. And then what we're going to do is cut using the saw along these guide cuts, and then you'll find that these pieces will fit together, and I'll show you how that works in a second. I'm going to cut these longer pieces and these shorter pieces separately, because for these longer pieces that go along the length of the cutting board, we only want to cut 1/3 of the depth and then flip it over and cut 1/3 from the other side. And I've made a mark on the side of my jig here at the 1/3 mark and also at the 2/3 mark. These shorter ones that go diagonally like this on the cutting board need to be cut 2/3 of the depth on one side only. Now I need to take these pieces that are cut to 2/3 depth, and keeping them the same way up but turning them this way around, I need to put them into this jig. And then I'm going to cut them on these lines so that they'll end up with, well, you'll see what we end up with after we've cut it. I would recommend that you save these little piles of sawdust here, because later on, if you find there's some small gaps in your woodwork, you can fill it with this sawdust and a little bit of glue. So the cut pattern, after you've made both cuts, looks somewhat like this. And of course now we need to take the chisel and remove this piece in the middle just like before. If the profiles of these are not quite perfect, you can use a small sanding stick to just make sure that they're completely smooth and meeting to a nice point and things like that. Otherwise, when you come to assembly, these won't really go together. At this point, these diagonal pieces should all be perfectly lined up with perfectly 60-degree bevels that meet exactly the middle of the wood. If you've managed to get to that point, there's a reasonable chance it's going to fit together. So the pieces pretty much line up, but it's much too tight. I think if I hit these with a mallet, I could probably get them to go down, or maybe I would split the wood, not sure. But either way, they need to be loosened up a little bit, like eased up a little bit. So I think what I'll do first is label them all so I can take them apart and put them back together repeatably. And then I think I'll make a triangle to go inside these little triangular compartments, which I can use to figure out, when a joint doesn't fit very well, like it's too tight, like where to ease it up, like which side is incorrect. It's hard to tell right now. But if I had a triangle of exactly the right size, I think that I could use that to figure out which pieces need to be adjusted slightly to make this thing, fit together easily. As you're working your way across these joints, easing them up a little bit with the sanding stick, I recommend you do two joints at first, like just the horizontals and one of the diagonals, and also use some clamps to make sure that the grid is being held at a perfect 60-degree angle whilst you fit these pieces together. Once you've got a two-layer grid done, then you can flip this over and start working on the other side. You can put the cross piece in upside down just to check that all the slots are lined up correctly, and you can also put the end of it in to make sure the slots are the correct width. To ensure that the slots are vertical, you can use an engineer's square like this, just to check that those are vertical. And you can make sure of the depth by using a marking gauge set to the correct height. So with a bit of easing with a file and some sandpaper and a bit of tapping, I've managed to get all these joints to go together. For the most part, they go together reasonably well, but there are some small gaps. That's okay. I saved some sawdust, so I can use a bit of sawdust and glue to fill those tiny cracks. I think this will look okay. So next it's time for the glue up. You want to glue it up on a flat surface. I have this torsion box which I made some years ago, which is nearly completely flat. It has these holes in it so you can put clamps through to clamp stuff down to the flat surface. That's what you'll need in order to make sure you glue this up in such a way that it's completely flat. So I've done the long ways ones, I've done one of the diagonals, and I've clamped everything down. And I use this precision angle, digital angle finder, to make sure that the grid is precisely 60 degrees. So it's now the following morning and the clamps are off, the glue is dry. It's not completely flat. There is a tiny rock in this direction. It should be okay. I mean, I'm going to flatten the whole thing afterwards anyway. I also made these slightly thicker than these, so these stick up is okay. That'll also be taken care of by the flattening process. Next step is to fill these triangles with these kind of three-pointed stars. When it comes to making these pieces here, which go in here like this, I would recommend that you make them a tiny bit large. By a tiny bit, I mean like 1/10 of a millimeter or 1/4 of a millimeter longer than they need to be. And then get a piece of sandpaper and attach it to a board, and then just rub them down slightly like this until they fit perfectly. Kumiko always involves a lot of repetition, and this project was no exception. I had to make 200 of these pieces, and it took quite a long while. Now it's on to the dark wood triangles. To make this jig, I took a piece of scrap 2x4, put it through the jointer to square it off, set my table saw at 30 degrees, and then cut it, like this, and then flipped it over and cut it again like this to create this hollow, which is at exactly 120 degrees. I also ran a router down the middle just to clean out the pointy bit. So from each of these planks of wood, of which I have 2, I can cut 4 of these triangular strips, which I can then cut into pieces to make the triangular pieces to fit into the pattern. But I only actually need 6, so I will have some wood left over. I thought what I'd do, instead of leaving a piece, like a strip like this left over, I might cut some bits off the end of this one and use it to make some legs. And then the strips will be a bit shorter, but I still have enough wood. So I've decided to add some legs. So to fit these dark wood triangles into these spaces, I've taken a piece of sandpaper and just stuck it to a piece of plywood. And what I'm doing is trying it, seeing where it's a little bit on the large side, sanding it down a little bit on this board until eventually it's a perfect fit. Now all I've got to do is repeat that for 150 of these triangles. As you can see, this technique gives you a very, very close fit between the black and the white wood. So many hours later, I have finally got to the very last piece to insert. You can see all of the rest of the board is done. This is the last piece. It fits quite nicely into this last space. I just need to put some glue on it, and then we'll spread the glue out and then see if we can just tap it home. So now that most of the construction is done, it's time to trim the edge of the board. I'm having to do this as a voiceover because unfortunately my DJI mic once again has failed to record any audio. It does this from time to time. So apologise for the lack of live audio. Can't do much about it now, but this is me trimming off the edges of the board. This is almost the final step. I also like to trim off the edge of my board at an angle of 30 degrees. I think this makes the board more attractive and also makes it much easier to pick up. So this project's almost done now. Just got to do a little bit of last minute sanding, and then we can apply some cutting board oil. And now, for the most satisfying part of any cutting board build, is is when you get to put the oil on it and you can see the true colour of the wood. I love this part. I think the dark wood will, go pretty black. The white wood hopefully will stay white and we'll get a nice black and white contrast. Let's see. Very nice. That really pops. So that brings us to the end of this project and also to the end of this video. I very enjoyed making this cutting board. I think it's my last cutting board. I don't think I'll make another one. I'm pretty satisfied with this one, and I'll definitely be keeping it and hopefully using it for many years to come. If you make a cutting board like this one, I'd love to see your video. Maybe you can make an even better job than I could. But this is the best that I could do for sure with this type of cutting board design. Hope you enjoy the video. See you next time.